Welcome to the fourth video in my entry in the Great Guitar Build-Off. We still have a ways to go, but by the end of this video we'll be well on our way. To start, we're going to get our fretboard laid out and slotted. Off camera, I already drew my center line and used a fret scale rule to mark my fret positions. Here, using a protractor, I'm drawing out my fret positions square to my center line. Once everything's laid out, I then cut the fretboard to width. And finally, we then cut the fret slots. Setting the fretboard aside for now, let's move on to the inlays, starting with my logo for the headstock. When cutting inlays, I like to start with all the inside cuts first before moving on to the perimeter. With everything cut, it's time to move on to the files to get everything smoothed and ready to be inlaid. Once I have the inlay itself done, I temporarily glue it to the headstock veneer with spray adhesive, and then scribe around it with a scalpel to mark where I need to cut the cavity. With the zero coat I'm using here, the scribed lines are very hard to see, so I colored over them with a gold Sharpie to add some contrast to the lines. And finally, the routing begins. Once the cavity has been routed out, I go back with a small chisel and clean everything up, test fitting the inlay as I go to get a perfect fit. Finally, the inlay is installed with some super glue and sanded flush. Here's the final result. Moving back to our fretboard, for the 12th fret inlay, I'm going to be trying a type of inlay I've never done before, usually referred to as wire inlay. First, just like the logo, the image is scribed onto the surface. A very sharp blade helps here. Then one at a time, each line segment is cut out with a 0.5 millimeter spiral upcut bit to the full depth of the wire, which in this case is about 1/8 of an inch. This is obviously a very slow process and something I need to come up with a little bit better method to do, as I broke a lot more bits than I'm willing to admit. Once the channel has been cut and cleaned, the wire can then be inlaid. So with this technique, each wire has its ends squared, and it's then shaped to match the channel, cut to final length, and then finally hammered into place, topped off with a dab of superglue just to make sure it stays put. Now I just have to do that 147 more times and it'll be done. Once all the wire has been inlaid, everything is filed flush with the surface of the fretboard. "22 hours later." Unfortunately, due to that wire inlay, I needed a flat surface to do all that routing on, so the fretboard has to be radiused the hard way. Now to make some binding. First I'll resaw a slice of about 400 thousandths off of a piece of walnut. Then I plane it flat. Slice that into strips of about 150 thousandths thick. And then plane all those flat. Now that I have all my binding made, I'll cut up some strips of wood veneer to use as purfling. Now to install the binding. I start with the fretboard since all the pieces are straight. I like to clamp it down to a flat surface to help keep the binding flush with the bottom of the fretboard to ease cleanup later. Once the glue is sufficiently dry, the binding is trimmed flush with the surface. And here's what it looks like. Setting the fretboard aside for now, I'll drill the access hole for the truss rod in preparation for gluing the headstock veneer on. Time to glue the headstock veneer down. In preparation, as usual, center lines were drawn, as well as position markers so I know exactly where it's supposed to sit. For the side dots, I went ahead and did them in brass to match the inlays. When I install these, I first lay them out by copying the fret slots down to the side of the fretboard using a square. Then with a ruler I mark corner to corner to find the exact center of each fret where the dot needs to be. Not too bad. Before I glued the fretboard down, I went ahead and cut the excess wood from the headstock. When I glue on a fretboard, I like to use a pair of locating pins to ensure it stays exactly where I want it when it comes time for glue. As usual, using my center lines, I position the fretboard where I want it and triple check it's in the right spot. I then drill 2 small holes right on the first and last fret slot that I'll later use small pin nails as the locating pins. I don't think I've ever seen anybody else do this but me, but when I install a truss rod, I like to wrap it in a layer of Teflon tape, the same stuff you'd use for plumbing. In my mind, this serves 2 purposes. First, to prevent any rattling if the truss rod was not under tension, and second, to prevent me from accidentally gluing it in place if I happen to get any glue in the slot. I also mask off the slot before applying glue. Can't be too safe. Time for the glue. While the glue's drying, I'm going to jump back on the body and cut the binding channels. Since I don't currently have a routing jig to cut these, I'm going to do it by hand. In hindsight though, I should have taken the time to make the jig, because this took me a good 10 hours to do. Before I can cut the binding channels for the headstock, I need to get it to its final shape, so it's out with a template and router. And then more hand-cut binding channels. Finally onto something a bit more fun, bending all of that wood binding. It's one of those things I quite enjoy, kind of slowly working the wood back and forth over the hot iron. It's kind of a therapeutic process. To install the binding, what I usually do is tape all the binding in place, getting all of my miters cut and fitted. When everything looks good, I go ahead and flow the joint with thin superglue. The binding on the body is done in the same way, but I'll usually fit one half of a side at a time. Then when I fit the second half, I go ahead and cut the splice at that time. Once everything's good and dry, it's all trimmed flush. And here's where I'm at now. In the next video, I'll finally get that neck carved, the frets installed, and get this whole instrument finished.